Hello, this is Stephen Wallace. This is my presentation, Detecting Fakes, Frauds, and Forgeries, Linguistics in Action. Here's some information about me. After my undergraduate education, I went to Cornell University and got a PhD in linguistics. I taught linguistics for several years. After that, I got a law degree. I practiced corporate law for a number of years, and I'm now retired. Here's a photo of me. I want to talk about fakes, frauds, and forgeries. Deception has a long history and has taken many forms. We obviously have financial frauds such as Ponzi schemes, the Bernie Madoff scandal from some years back, and now the world of cryptocurrency and the debacle of FTX. And then there are all kinds of confidence games and scams in many forms. Not only that, there are well attested in many cases of artistic frauds, such as passing off paintings as old masters of works of important artists. But in this presentation, I'm focusing on fakes, frauds, and forgeries involving writings and the role of linguistic analysis in exposing the deception. We start with Western classical antiquity. The world of ancient Greece and Rome produced many texts that have survived in the form of manuscripts. Over many centuries, some forgeries of these texts were detected, but many of these texts were not examined critically. But beginning in the late 17th century, some scholars started to take a more careful approach. A leader of this endeavor was Richard Bentley. Well, he was a classical scholar. At the peak of his career, he served as master of Trinity College, Cambridge. Here is a photo of what Trinity College, Cambridge looks like today, and there is a portrait of Richard Bentley. In particular, Bentley wrote extensively about the letters of the tyrant Phalaris, who ruled the Greek colony Acragas in Sicily around 2,500 years ago. Acragas is now modern Agrigento in Sicily, and here are a couple of photos showing some of the monuments left by the Greeks from that era. It's obviously very impressive. This was an important place. It's on a plateau overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this ruler, Phalaris, is often referred to as a tyrant. And the reason for that is he had a reputation for being not just harsh and not just cruel, but excessively cruel. Phalaris supposedly wrote a lot of letters, 148 of them, with various literary and philosophical themes. In 1695, an English nobleman named Charles Boyle edited these, and they, at the time were viewed as significant. But several years later, this scholar, Richard Bentley at Cambridge, published a dissertation claiming that these letters were fakes, not written by the tyrant Phalaris, but by written someone living some centuries after he ruled. How did he do this? A modern scholar has said Bentley used his extraordinary command of the whole of Greek language and literature, numismatics, epigraphy, and chronology to pile up inconsistencies and anachronisms of many different kinds to make his point, including there were references to towns that didn't exist. There were stylistic imitations of authors who were not yet living, and it was the wrong Greek dialect. Who really wrote these letters if it wasn't Phalaris the tyrant? Well, no one knows for sure, but a suspect is a man called Adrianus of Tyre, who died around 1800 years ago. Adrianus was a Greek philosopher who started his career in Athens, but ended up moving to Rome, where he served under the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. More about this later. Well, what's the point here? Not many people have ever heard of Phalaris, the tyrant of Sicily, or Richard Bentley, the famous scholar at Cambridge. But the point is, Richard Bentley was maybe not the first, but one of the first people to really look at documents, texts, with a very critical eye. Some people view him as the founder of historical philology. And also his dissertation about these letters of Phalaris and his analysis are often viewed as a landmark use of what's called the field of textual criticism. All right, we now move from the obscure to the familiar. Here is Shakespeare. Also in 18th century in England, Shakespeare became popular. Many documents relating to Shakespeare came to be discovered or, quote, discovered, unquote. The world of fakes, frauds, and forgeries took off like a rocket. So here we meet a young man named William Henry Ireland. Here is a sort of a photo of an engraving of William Henry. Starting when he was 19 years old, William Henry created various documents supposedly written by Shakespeare. He went so far as to create a play, not a short play, but a whole length play, supposedly written by Shakespeare, which had never been known up to that point, called Vortigern and Rowena. It was performed in London in 1796 when William Henry was around 21 years old. Many experts and prominent people were impressed with all this, but not all. There was a lot of controversy. In fact, the literati and glitterati of London were divided into two camps. One camp called the Believers with a capital B, and the other camp called the Non-Believers with a capital N and a capital B. And in those days, there was a newspaper published on every corner, and the newspapers were full of stories about all this. Well, what happened? These documents, supposedly discovered by William Henry, were exposed as frauds. The first problem was provenance. William Henry could not really plausibly explain where he got these. He said, well, I got them from a Mr. H, but he couldn't identify really Mr. H, who didn't want to be, identified. And he couldn't explain why a Mr. H would have given him all these documents, supposedly very valuable, for essentially nothing. So there was that problem. There's the problem of spelling. William Henry, frankly, had a madcap style of spelling. In an attempt to make the documents look older than they were, he overdid the attempt to make the spelling look old. Then there's the choice of words and other factors. He had a later career as a writer, and in 1805, when he was around 30 years old, he published his Confessions. He admitted to his deception and explained in great detail how he went about it. Very interesting. One modern scholar, a British fellow, in the very sort of terse and direct way that the British have, says that William Henry had much vigor but little art. Well, more about William Henry later. We now move to more modern times, 40 years ago, 1983. In that year, some 60 volumes of books appeared on the scene in West Germany. These were supposedly diaries written by Adolf Hitler in his hand. These diaries were allegedly lost in a plane crash near Dresden shortly before the end of the Second World War. The German news magazine Stern bought these diaries for an amount of money that in today's terms is over $11 million. And Stern was not only going to publish information about this, in its own magazine in Germany, but they entered into negotiations to sell serialization rights to other people. One of them was a company called News International, which owned the Times and the Sunday Times of London. Well, News International was owned by Rupert Murdoch. We have all heard of him. They also entered into negotiations with Newsweek, the American news magazine. In fact, Rupert Murdoch was personally involved in these negotiations. It was a really big deal back at the time. Here is Stern's famous cover story published on April 25th, 1983, just a few days more than 40 years after I'm speaking. Hitler's Tagebücher entdeckt. Hitler's diaries discovered. And there are pictures of these diaries, these black notebooks, all in a big stack. It was obviously a sensation. At the beginning, the authenticity of the diaries was verified by several experts, but it's a complicated situation. After not too long, some of them changed their views. And the matter was referred to the Bundesarchiv. The Bundesarchiv is the German Federal Archives, who were to look into this. Well, after not too long, the Bundesarchiv and other experts concluded that the diaries were fakes. One problem was, where did they come from? They were supposedly in an airplane near the end of the Second World War, flying from Berlin to maybe Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. But the plane ended up crashing. And eyewitnesses at the time said there was a huge fireball. So, how did these 60 plus books survive a fiery crash like that? And where this happened was, it ended up being at the end of the Second World War, the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, which turned into the German Democratic Republic, commonly known as East Germany. So, how did these things last from, after a fiery plane crash from 1945 to 1983? And then, given the tightly controlled border between East Germany and West Germany, how did they make the way into West Germany? There were other problems with paper, ink, and binding. One aspect of this was the technical analysis showed that the binding included a plastic that was not produced until after the end of the Second World War. There were factual errors. The content of these diaries is not consistent with Hitler's public statements. And there are problems with handwriting the signatures, especially the signatures. And there's external evidence. It may seem kind of, what's the word, sort of unusual to say, but in 1983, there were still some people alive who had worked under Hitler. And they were interviewed, and none of them had any recollection that he had ever kept a diary. So, all these problems indicate fakery. Well, who was the forger? The fraudster was identified as Konrad Kujau, who had a history of petty crime and deception. One interesting thing is his nickname was Connie, spelled Connie. Think about that. There's a bit of irony there. Also implicated was a journalist working for the magazine Stern named Gert Heidemann. Connie and Gert were prosecuted. Each served over 4 years in prison. And not only that, there were a number of other journalists involved in all this who lost their jobs. Well, the Hitler diaries are now mostly preserved at the Bundesarchiv. They're also available online if you're interested. We now move to the Gospel of Jesus' wife. The word gospel, the modern English word gospel, comes from the Old English word godspell. It's a translation via Latin of the Greek word evangelion, meaning good tidings or good news. Greek, of course, being the original language of the Christian scriptures. The Christian scriptures contain 4 books called Gospels, attributed to their authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were written around 1950 to 1900 years ago, and they're known as the canonical Gospels. What does that mean? They were the Gospels included in the official compilation of the Christian scriptures known as the New Testament. And that official compilation is referred to as the canon. But also in the early years of the Christian era, other writings appeared, some of which are also called Gospels, which did not become part of the canon. These are such as the Gospels of Thomas, Peter, Judas, and Mary. And of course, these are referred to as the non canonical Gospels. We now move to Harvard Divinity School. In 2012, a little over 10 years ago, Professor Karen King of Harvard Divinity School announced at a conference the discovery of a fragment of papyrus that implied that some early Christians believed that Jesus was married. And this came to be known as the Gospel of Jesus' wife. This fragment of papyrus is rectangular. Just in simple terms, it's a little smaller than the credit cards that are in your wallet. It has writing on both sides. It's written in the Coptic language. Well, Coptic is or was the ordinary spoken language of Egypt many years ago. But when the Arabs conquered Egypt, their language, Arabic, gradually supplanted Coptic, so that now and for several centuries, there have not been any native speakers of Coptic. The ordinary spoken language of Egypt today is Arabic. Coptic has survived as the religious language of Egyptian Christians, similar to what, the situation of Latin that survived for centuries as the religious language of the Catholic Church. Professor King suggested that this fragment was a 4th century Coptic translation of a gospel, maybe composed in Greek in the 2nd century. This is what it looks like. And there is a translation. And sort of cutting through all this, look at the second line of the translation, which is the sort of key part. It says, Jesus said to them, my wife, she is able to be my disciple. Well, this was obviously a sensation for several reasons. One is for some decades now, these non canonical gospels have been the subject of a lot of interest in terms of what they might show in terms of the history of early Christianity beyond what's actually in the New Testament or some of the writings of the early Christian authors. Secondly, during this same time period, in the past few decades, there's been a lot of interest in subjects of gender, sexuality, and the role of women. And third, if Jesus had been married, what does this implicate for the position of the Catholic Church that priests be celibate? So there are several topics here that were, implicated in this revelation. Well, a lengthy controversy arose about the authenticity of the fragment. After months of physical, scientific, and linguistic analysis, many experts concluded that the fragment was a fake. The provenance was unclear. Where did it originally come from? Very murky. Scientific dating, as I recall, in the form of radiocarbon testing, indicated an origin maybe in the 8th century, 400 years after the date that Professor King suggested. The fragment, according to various experts, had abnormal physical properties, and there were problems with the text, handwriting, and grammar, and it's said to have been written in the wrong dialect of the Coptic language. In 2016, 4 years after Professor King revealed this fragment of papyrus, she said that the evidence tips the balance towards forgery. Well, okay, if it's a forgery, who did it? The suspected forger is a man named Walter Fritz. Walter Fritz was born and grew up in Germany. Around 1994, he moved to Florida. But in his earlier years, he studied Egyptology at a university in Berlin. He dropped out of university after being accused of plagiarism. But as part of his university program, he studied Coptic. Well, he had a mixed career in Florida. For a while, he sold auto parts. And then for a while, he and his wife had a web based pornography business. On top of all that, in connection with a job application in Florida, he submitted a fake master's degree from Germany. But he has claimed to be the owner of the fragment, which he loaned to Harvard at no charge. And according to people who have spoken to him, he has denied creating the fragment, but said that he probably could have done it. Now, think about that, putting that into simple terms. What has he said? I didn't make this piece, but I probably could have done it. Think about that. Here is Professor King. In 2019, she started a phased retirement from Harvard. Her website now says that she is on leave. Here is Harvard's logo with the motto Veritas. It's the Latin word that means truth. Truth has always been a difficult subject, and it's gotten even more difficult today in the world of the internet social media, and certain cable TV programs. Well, 2,000 years ago, the Romans had a bit of advice. Caveat emptor. It means let the buyer beware. The buyer, whether you're putting up money or whether you're putting up a reputation or anything else of value, be careful. Here, I want to summarize some common themes of these case studies that I have looked into. And these examples that I have brought forward are the tip of the iceberg of fakes, frauds, and forgeries. But I think they are some of the most interesting. And of course, here we're talking about the authentication of objects with writing. And there are several types of analysis involved. The first is provenance. Where do these things come from? And we've seen that in all these situations, the provenance is uncertain. William Henry could not satisfactorily explain where he got these documents, supposedly written by Shakespeare. And Connie Kuyau could not really explain how these diaries of Hitler showed up from a fiery plane crash decades before. And Walter Fritz could not explain where that fragment came from. Well, we have the scientific physical analysis of the object, which in modern times has become very sophisticated. But, in terms of chemical analysis and radiocarbon dating and all these sorts of things. But these forgers, they have tried to be very clever. For example, William Henry, in forging the document supposedly written by Shakespeare, he, in an attempt to make them look older than they were, he cut out pages, blank pages from books dating back to more or less the time of Shakespeare. So the paper would look of that age. And he had an accomplice who created a special ink to make it look like the ink of Shakespeare's time. And not only that, after he used that ink to write whatever he wrote on that paper, he would hold it up in front of a fireplace to let it get just a tiny bit brown so it would look old. So this is the type of thing that some of these people, the extent that they go to. But in modern times, we do have various scientific techniques. Well, we have the linguistic analysis of the text, which is my primary focus. We've seen situations where the dialect of the language isn't right, the spelling isn't right. I think I said William Henry went overboard trying to make the spelling look older than it was. Style, content, grammar, phraseology, and terminology, all of these subjects are useful to determine whether something is authentic. And then we have the very interesting subject of analyzing handwriting and signatures. We often refer to an area of academic study as a field. And so let's think about the field of linguistics and think about that word field. Well, it really sort of means a space out in the country, like where maybe you pasture animals or something. And at least here in the United States, fields are often enclosed with fences. So, what do we have within the field of linguistics inside the fence? Well, we have phonetics and phonology and morphology and syntax and semantics and historical linguistics and sociolinguistics and psycholinguistics and dialectology and various other subjects. Handwriting, or the analysis of handwriting and signatures, has typically not been included within this field inside the fence, but I would say if it's not inside the fence, it's right outside the fence. In particular, the subject of analyzing signatures is a fascinating topic. And one of the things that brought down Connie Kuyau was his attempt to imitate Hitler's signature. Turned out, with careful scrutiny, to be just clumsy imitations. Now, in reviewing the literature about all this, many authors don't focus very much on the technical details. They are very much interested in the people involved and the motivations of the people and the profiles of the people and the backgrounds of the people involved. So I'm going to take off my hat as a linguist for a little while and put on a hat of an amateur psychologist and talk some about the motivations of a forger. Well, we would often think the primary motivation of a forger is greed. The forger wants to make money. Well, it turns out that this is an important motivation, particularly somebody like Connie Kuyau, who in fact extorted a lot of money out of the news magazine. But there are lots of other motivations, and I'm going to go through some that I've identified from the case studies that I've reviewed. And I think one important point is these motivations are not mutually exclusive. And there may well be others if you study other cases, but I'm going to go through these because I think they're fascinating. 300 years ago, Richard Bentley, in dealing with the letters of Phalaris, he said motivations of a forger are not just greed, but there could also be what he called glory and affectation. Those are his words and his spelling from 300 years ago. A modern author has identified the audacity of rogues, the revolt against the world's conventional standards. We also come across political or cultural or literary reinventions or rehabilitation. In the case of the letters of Phalaris, again, we're not quite sure who the author of these was, but one modern writer has said, well, these are a literary reinvention. Okay. I would say not only that, but it could well have been an attempt of someone to try to whitewash a difficult era of the history of the great people. And in the case of the Hitler diaries, Connie Kuyau and his associate Heidemann, they were friends with ex-Nazis, Nazi sympathizers, and collectors of Nazi memorabilia. And I think that it's probably clear that Connie was attempting, well, in a small way, to try to make Hitler seem not quite the monster that he really was. Retaliation, getting back at somebody in simple English terms. This seems to have been the main motivation of Walter Fritz and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Now, Walter Fritz was never targeted or damaged or affected at all by Harvard or Professor King, but he seems to have felt that in his university days, he was not treated right by the academic establishment. So this forgery of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife seems to have been a way that he wanted to get back to expose or denigrate the academic establishment. Personal affirmation. And here we come to William Henry. William Henry grew up in a difficult family situation. His father was difficult and demanding. His father lived with a woman, a Mrs. Freeman, who was referred to as the housekeeper. But in all likelihood, she was William Henry's father's mistress. And William Henry never quite knew who his mother was, but the likelihood is this Mrs. Freeman was his mother. Well, in this already difficult family, William Henry was viewed as the dunce of the group. Well, his father was an artist and a collector, somebody who collected various old things. So, William Henry, in terms of wanting to make something of himself, he seems to have created these writings of Shakespeare to prove to his father that he was really something. Here's a quotation from a recent book about history. It's, I would even call it a history of history. The author says, history has ever been a harbor for dishonest writing, a home for forgers, the insane, or even history killers who write so dully they neutralize their subjects. What about the victims? The word that comes up over and over and over again as you read about all of this, the word is gullibility. You start with collectors. William Henry's father was a collector. In all the reading I've done about all of this, I haven't seen anything specific about the psychology of collectors, but just sort of putting on my hat as an amateur psychologist. You know, collectors, they start out gathering some similar things and they get excited and they want to acquire even more similar things. It gives them a sense of satisfaction. Plus, they can brag to their fellow collectors and friends, oh, look at all these good things that I've been able to put together. So that's one type of person who is involved as a victim of this sort of thing. But there are other targets. And when I say targets, there's this word mark. Criminals, in their jargon, they refer to their targets as marks. The news magazine Stern was an obvious mark for somebody like Connie Kuyal. It was a well-known publication, a lot of money behind it. Oh boy, he was just going to cash out. But there are other situations. Walter Fritz, Harvard, and Professor King, obvious targets for what he wanted to do to retaliate against the academic establishment. You also have dealers. In the four cases that I've dealt with, we haven't had dealers involved, but there are lots and lots of other situations where you have dealers involved. The dealers being the intermediaries between the person who comes up with something interesting and potentially valuable and the ultimate customer, whether the collector or somebody else. And then you have these experts or so called experts who are engaged to authenticate or not something desirable or potentially valuable. This is the more I have looked at all this, the more I would suggest that anybody involved in this area needs to be extremely cautious about who is engaged as an expert, who really has the credentials, who really has the background, who really has the experience, because there are lots of situations that are very dubious. But ultimately, In the situation of the victims, you end up with a desire to believe. I have a quotation here from a recent book written by an expert psychologist focusing on confidence games in great depth. I think it's worth reading this quotation from her book. The true con artist doesn't force us to do anything. He makes us complicit in our own undoing. He doesn't steal, we give. He doesn't have to threaten us. We supply the story ourselves. We believe, there's that word, we believe because we want to, not because anybody made us. And so we offer up whatever they want: money, reputation, trust, fame, legitimacy, support, and we don't realize what's happening until it's too late. And this same author says a con artist engages in the manipulation of belief. There's that word again. I have a quotation here from another work focusing on forgery. The author says, the history of literature is strewn with the reputations of the learned who have either wrongly doubted or wrongly believed. We now move to today's world. I'm speaking on May 1st, 2023. The world is much focused on artificial intelligence, that is, using a machine to mimic the intelligence of biological creatures. AI takes many forms, such as developing computer systems to assist doctors to diagnose conditions, and the attempts to develop self-driving vehicles. Just some examples. In late 2022, fewer than 6 months ago, generative AI arrived on the scene in the form of ChatGPT, a program developed by a company named OpenAI. ChatGPT can generate music, images, and videos. I'm not going to talk about those, but ChatGPT can also generate text, that is language, which is the focus here. Generative AI, especially ChatGPT, has generated a lot of concern in many areas. Teachers believe that it will facilitate cheating. Publishers believe that it will reduce the traffic to their websites, thus decreasing their advertising revenue. Political commentators believe that it will accelerate the spread of disinformation. And professionals in some businesses, such as advertising and marketing, are worried that ChatGPT could eliminate their jobs. And parents are concerned about what their children might do with it. As reported on March 30th, which is just over a month ago before I'm speaking, over 1,000 technology leaders and researchers signed an open letter calling for a moratorium on further development of AI tools, citing profound risks to society and humanity. And some people want special governmental regulation. Now, looking back at the case studies that I've talked about, traditional concerns have focused on authorship. Who is the real author of? First of all, the letters of Phalaris. Was it the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily or someone else? Well, it was someone else. These documents supposedly discovered by William Henry Ireland. Did Shakespeare write them or someone else? Well, it wasn't Shakespeare, it was William Henry. What about the Hitler diaries? Were they written by Hitler or someone else? Well, they were created by Connie Kuyal. Now, what about the Gospel of Jesus' wife? Was this written by a scribe in 4th century Egypt or someone else? Well, most likely Walter Fritz. Moving to today, if you get ChatGPT to write a short story for you, who is the author? And when I say if you get ChatGPT to write a short story for you, what I imagine is you log into ChatGPT and you give ChatGPT some very basic profiles of a couple of characters, John and Jane, and the outline of a story or a plot or something. And with a couple of clicks of the mouse, you tell ChatGPT, hey, write a short story. Well, okay, it does it. Now, OpenAI, the company that owns ChatGPT, seems to claim to be the actual author, but they assign to you, that is, they legally transfer to you all right, title, and interest of authorship. So, as between OpenAI and you, they're treating you as the author, subject to, some legal terms and conditions. They say you can publish the short story under your own name, but you have to agree to acknowledge OpenAI's role. Then, what about a legal copyright on the work? Most authors want a legal copyright so they get the economic benefit of having published whatever it is. But the last point, what about the possibility that in sweeping the web to create the short story, OpenAI has infringed on the copyrights of traditional authors? This whole subject of copyright here in these last two bullet points is much discussed and debated as we speak or as I speak. It's uncertain and it's obviously something that's going to be worked out over time, but we're not quite sure exactly how. In conclusion, in today's digital world of generative AI, such as ChatGPT, what are the implications for, first of all, the traditional search for true authorship? And secondly, the traditional detection of fakes, frauds, and forgeries of written works? I'll leave you with these questions. I don't have answers. We will see how it plays out. But before I sign off, I want to roll some credits to my wife, Christine, who taught classics at Rice University for many years, who always has good points for me. Professor Matthias Henze at Rice, who has offered interesting information. The Fondren Library at Rice, the people who work there, it's a great place to do research. And Kay DeVore, who is a genius at helping somebody like me prepare a presentation like this. I have some references here if you want to pursue these topics further and go into their detailed backgrounds. All right, there's a continuation of the references. Here is ways in which you can contact me if you have questions or comments or criticisms or supplements or anything else you'd like to say. Here are a couple of other recent works that I have published. The first one about noun incorporation of English. In a way, it's kind of a technical linguistic subject, but in a way, it's some interesting commentary about modern American English that might be of interest to some people. The second one about linguistic problem solving, well, there's some history there. It's, I think, generally accessible to the general reader. So, thank you so much.